On the street of a small provincial town, a little girl walked sadly. She looked to be about 5 or 6 years old, though she was actually almost 8. This was due to her unusual thinness and short stature. Her clothes, which clearly didn't fit her, added to this impression as they hung on her like a sack. Her name was Victoria. One might think she was an orphan, but that wasn't the case. A tragedy had befallen her family. She lived with her mother, who had to juggle between work and raising her daughter to somehow provide food and clothing for both of them. Her mother spent all day at the open-air market selling various goods. She was paid by the hour, so she worked without weekends and in any weather. Rain, which the tattered awning didn't completely protect her from, and cutting winds. It wasn't surprising that she got sick from such work, but since she wasn't officially employed, no one would pay for her sick leave. So, she stayed behind the counter, already suffering from a severe cold, until things got worse. At the clinic, they told her she had pneumonia and needed to be hospitalized. "But with whom will I leave my daughter?" "No, I can't go to the hospital," she pleaded. "I can't force you," the doctor sighed, "but at the very least you should have absolute rest. And here's a list of medications you need to take." The list turned out to be extensive, and she simply couldn't afford most of the prescribed medications. She couldn't rely on any help. Her unfortunate parents had passed away many years ago due to alcoholism, and she had no husband, nor had she ever had one. Victoria's father had abandoned her mother as soon as he found out she was pregnant, so she had to do everything on her own. Her daughter tried to help as much as she could, applying compresses and buying the few affordable medicines from the list. However, these turned out to be only supportive remedies and had no effect. The fever continued to rise, and sometimes they couldn't bring it down. The mother began to slip into a semi-delirious state. At first, Victoria hoped her mother would get better over time. Usually, it's like that with a cold. At first, everything gets worse and worse, but then you reach a certain point and gradually you start to recover. But as it turned out, this wasn't the case. The illness had progressed to a severe form that wouldn't pass on its own. And so, Victoria walked down the street without really understanding why. Perhaps she was hoping to find some food, even just a little. Ideally, chicken. She had heard that chicken broth helps with a cold. Of course, this wouldn't replace the expensive medicines, but maybe it could at least ease her mother's condition a little. As for obtaining the medicines themselves, the girl didn't dare to hope. You can't just go to a pharmacy and say that your mother is dying and you have no money for medicine. This image was in front of her eyes. She stood in front of the pharmacy counter and in a tearful voice begged, "Ma'am, please give me these medicines and I'll bring you the money later when my mother gets better and can earn it." The pharmacist, an older woman with kind eyes but a hardened heart from years of hearing similar pleas, shook her head gently. "I'm sorry, dear," she would say, her voice filled with a mix of pity and resignation. "But without payment, there's nothing I can do. The medicine is expensive and I have to make a living too." The girl's chest tightened at the thought, her breath catching in her throat. The desperation was like a heavy weight pressing down on her, crushing her tiny frame. But she couldn't let it end like that. In her mind, the scene continued to play out, shifting to a different, more hopeful version. What if, instead of turning her away, the pharmacist leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper? "Come back tonight after we close. I'll leave the medicine by the back door, but you must be quick, and you mustn't tell anyone." The girl's heart would race with a mix of hope and fear. Could she trust this woman? What if it was a trap? But what choice did she have? She imagined herself nodding vigorously, her eyes wide with gratitude and trepidation. She would clutch the woman's hand, her tiny fingers trembling, and whisper, "Thank you. Thank you so much." Yet she knew this was just a fantasy, a cruel trick her mind played to give her a moment's respite from the grim reality. The truth was, there would be no secret help, no miraculous intervention. The world was not a place where such kindness was offered freely, especially not to a poor girl with nothing to give in return. As she stood there, staring at the empty space in front of her, she knew she had to think of something else, something real. She couldn't rely on dreams or hope alone. She had to find a way to save her mother, even if it meant doing something she had never done before. The idea came slowly, almost reluctantly, but once it took hold, it wouldn't let go. It was dangerous, it was illegal, and it was the only option left. Imagining the lady's reaction to such a statement, Victoria laughed bitterly. It occurred to her that she could try to earn some money herself. But how? She had no idea. After all, no one hires children, especially as young as she was. Well, stealing was definitely out of the question. Her thoughts were interrupted by a strange glint that caught her attention in the nearest trash can. Approaching, she realized that the glint came from a bank card lying on top of all the garbage. Victoria picked it up and examined it closely. Attached to the card was a small piece of paper with 4 numbers carefully written on it, probably the PIN. Victoria's mother also had a bank card, though it rarely had any money on it. Sometimes her mother sent her with the card to buy groceries or withdraw some cash from the nearest ATM, so the girl knew very well how to handle these things. Well, if it's in the trash, Victoria said to herself, then it must have been thrown away, and if it was thrown away, it's unlikely anyone needs it. With that in mind, she headed to the nearest ATM, not holding out much hope that there would be any money on the card. Who would throw away a card with money on it? Well, if by some chance there was any, it would be useful. She could buy medicines for her mother, or at least some chicken for soup. Of course, doubts crept into her mind about the correctness of her actions. What if the card ended up in the trash by mistake? On the other hand, if someone could accidentally throw away money, it meant they didn't need it as much as she and her mother did. And their situation was desperate. If her mother didn't get help soon, she might even die. With this thought, tears welled up in Victoria's eyes, and she quickened her pace. Upon reaching the ATM, the girl first checked the card's balance. When she saw the amount displayed on the screen, her eyes widened in shock. Until that moment, she couldn't even imagine that a person could have so much money. By her calculations, the sum she saw would be enough for her and her mother for almost a lifetime. All her doubts vanished at once. A person with such wealth wouldn't suffer much if she took a little money for her mother's medicine. Victoria didn't intend to withdraw a large amount. Leaving the bank, she headed straight to the nearest pharmacy. She bought all the necessary medicines for her mother. Her estimate was correct, as almost no money was left. Victoria, whose thoughts were still occupied with the healing chicken soup, decided to go to the grocery store and see if she could buy something with the remaining money. As she left the pharmacy, she bumped into a woman who, although not young, looked quite affluent. The woman looked at her attentively with an expression Victoria couldn't quite understand, and then unexpectedly asked, "Girl, did you withdraw money from the ATM nearby?" Victoria shuddered. She understood. This woman was the owner of the card. Now she would probably be accused of theft. Dragged to the police, and the girl wouldn't have time to take the medicine to her mother. Tears filled her eyes once more. "I did," she confessed honestly. "But I found this card in the trash, so I thought no one needed it anymore. You have to understand, we really need the money. My mother is sick, and we have no way to buy her medicine." The woman's eyes narrowed, and Victoria could see a flicker of suspicion mixed with something else. Perhaps a hint of pity? She wasn't sure, and she didn't dare to hope. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line as she looked at the card in her hand, then back at Victoria. The silence between them felt like an eternity, the air thick with tension. Finally, the woman spoke, her voice low and measured. "You found it in the trash, you say?" There was no anger in her tone, just a cool, detached curiosity. Victoria nodded vigorously, the tears now spilling freely down her cheeks. She was terrified, but more than that, she was desperate. "Yes, ma'am. I swear, I didn't steal it. I just thought..." Her voice broke and she struggled to find the words. "I thought it could help us. My mother, she's all I have. And without the medicine, I didn't know what else to do." The woman studied Victoria for a long moment, her gaze piercing and unyielding. Then, to Victoria's surprise, she let out a soft sigh and shook her head. "You're just a child," she muttered almost to herself. A child caught in a situation no one should have to face. Victoria didn't know what to say. The fear of being taken away by the police still loomed large, but there was something in the woman's demeanor that made her think maybe, just maybe, there was a chance she wouldn't be punished. After what felt like forever, the woman spoke again, her voice gentler this time. "I could report you, you know. But what good would that do? It wouldn't get your mother her medicine, and it wouldn't fix whatever's broken in your life." She paused, her eyes softening slightly as she continued. "But this card, using it would have been wrong, no matter where you found it. It's not your money to take." Victoria's heart sank. She knew the woman was right, but it didn't make the reality any easier to bear. She bit her lip, trying to stifle a sob, and nodded in agreement. I know, she whispered. I'm sorry, I didn't know what else to do. The woman looked at Victoria with a mixture of sadness and resolve. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small wallet. Here, she said, handing Victoria a few bills. It's not much, but it should be enough to get your mother some of the medicine she needs. But you have to promise me something. Victoria looked up at her, wide-eyed and hopeful. Anything, she said quickly. Promise me you'll never try something like this again, the woman said firmly. No matter how desperate you are, there are other ways to get help. Stealing or even finding and using something that isn't yours isn't the answer. Victoria nodded earnestly, clutching the money in her hand as if it were a lifeline. I promise, she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. The woman nodded in return, her expression softening. Good. Now go before I change my mind. Victoria didn't need to be told twice. She thanked the woman profusely, her heart pounding with a mix of relief and lingering fear, and then she turned and ran as fast as her legs would carry her, clutching the precious money to her chest. She had a promise to keep and a mother to save. Well, calm down, the woman said gently. I know you didn't steal anything. It was my cleaning lady who accidentally threw away the card. We have an office nearby, and that's how it ended up in the trash. Besides, I know how much money was on the card, and you only took a little, not for yourself, but to help someone close to you. Victoria couldn't calm down. She kept apologizing incoherently and murmuring about her mother's illness. She showed the bag of medicines and the receipt as proof that she had spent the money exactly as she had said. Finally, after a few minutes, she managed to ask, "What's your name?" "Victoria," she whispered. "My name is Victoria. Pleased to meet you. You know, Victoria, let's buy some more vitamins and some groceries to help your mother feel better. Consider it a reward for your discovery." Together, they bought vitamins and went to the grocery store. The woman filled an entire basket with fruits, vegetables, milk for Victoria, and the much-desired chicken. Now she could definitely make a great broth for her mother. At 7 years old, she was already quite skilled in the kitchen. Letitia helped carry the groceries home. She didn't go inside, leaving everything in the hallway. The girl invited her savior to at least come in for a cup of coffee, but she politely declined. "I recently had a cold," she explained, "so it's better if I don't stay near sick people now. Besides, your mother clearly has more important things to think about. Here, take my phone number in case you need anything." Thanking the woman for her kindness, Victoria gave her mother a dose of the medicine and began preparing the broth. Her mother's condition worried her greatly. The semi-delirious state seemed almost constant. The girl feared that help might come too late. 2 days passed, and her mother's condition only worsened. Victoria couldn't feed her or even make her take the medicine. In the end, she lost all contact with reality, and Victoria decided to call an ambulance. Her mother was taken to the hospital, refusing to let the girl in despite all her pleas. Not knowing what to do next, the girl dialed Letitia's number and explained the situation in a trembling voice. "I'm sorry to bother you, but my mother has gotten worse. They took her to the hospital, and they won't let me in. I don't know what to do. I'm sorry, I just don't have anyone else to turn to," the girl explained. "Don't worry, Victoria," Letitia responded kindly. "I'll come to you right away and we'll figure it all out." And indeed, she arrived in just half an hour. "I've been thinking, Victoria," she began almost as soon as she entered. "If you'd like, you can stay with us for now. We have plenty of space at home, and my husband won't mind. Did the doctors tell you which hospital your mother was taken to?" Victoria simply nodded, unable to say a word. "All right, I'll go there now to talk to the doctors. Maybe there's something more that can be done to help her. Don't worry, everything will be okay." Victoria agreed to stay with Letitia, and without wasting any time, they headed to her house. As it turned out, not far from the neighborhood, with its gray, identical 5-story buildings, there was a completely different world. They arrived at a private sector where several streets were filled with luxurious mansions. And it was in one of these mansions that Victoria's savior lived. The mansion was grand, with tall iron gates that opened automatically as Letitia approached. The driveway was lined with perfectly manicured hedges, and the house itself loomed large and elegant, with tall windows that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Victoria couldn't help but stare in awe. She had never seen anything like it. It was a stark contrast to the cramped, worn-down apartment she called home. Letitia noticed Victoria's wide-eyed expression and offered her a warm smile. It's just a house, Victoria, she said softly. What matters is what's inside, both the house and the people in it. Victoria nodded, though she wasn't sure she fully understood. To her, the house seemed like a palace, and she couldn't imagine how her life could have led her to cross paths with someone who lived in such a place. As they entered the mansion, Victoria was struck by the warmth of the interior. Despite its size, the house felt inviting, with soft lighting and cozy furnishings. The air smelled faintly of fresh flowers, and the sound of classical music played softly in the background. It was peaceful, a world away from the noise and chaos of her own life. Letitia led Victoria to a comfortable sitting room where a man, tall and kind-looking, was waiting. He had a calm demeanor and a reassuring presence that immediately put Victoria at ease. "This is my husband, Eduardo," Letitia introduced him. "He'll keep you company while I go check on your mother." Eduardo smiled warmly at Victoria, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Victoria," he said, extending his hand. "You're in good hands here. Letitia will make sure your mother gets the care she needs." Victoria shook his hand timidly, still overwhelmed by everything that had happened. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Letitia placed a gentle hand on Victoria's shoulder. "I'll be back as soon as I can, okay? Don't worry. Everything will be fine." Victoria nodded, though the anxiety still gnawed at her insides. She watched as Letitia left the room, the sound of her heels clicking softly on the polished floors. Once she was gone, Eduardo turned to Victoria with a kind smile. "Would you like something to eat, Victoria? You must be hungry after all that's happened," he offered, gesturing toward the kitchen. Victoria hesitated, her stomach tight with nerves, but the mention of food reminded her of how long it had been since she had last eaten. She nodded shyly. "Yes, please," she said softly. Eduardo led her to the kitchen, which was just as grand and welcoming as the rest of the house. He began to prepare a simple meal, chatting casually with Victoria as he worked. He spoke in a gentle, reassuring tone, asking her about her interests and trying to make her feel at home. As they talked, Victoria began to relax, if only a little. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt safe, like maybe, just maybe, things would turn out all right. But even as she nibbled on the sandwich Eduardo had made for her, her thoughts kept drifting back to her mother, lying in that hospital bed. She couldn't shake the fear that it might already be too late. Meanwhile, Letitia hurried to the hospital, her mind racing with concern. She knew time was of the essence, and she silently prayed that they weren't too late. When she arrived, she quickly made her way to the room where Victoria's mother was staying, her heart pounding in her chest. As she pushed open the door, she was met with the sight of a frail woman lying in the bed, her breathing shallow and labored. Letitia's heart ached at the sight. She immediately approached the nurse on duty, asking for an update on the woman's condition. The nurse sighed, her expression grave. "She's in a critical state," she explained. "We're doing everything we can, but without the proper medication, it's touch and go. We were hoping someone would come for her." Letitia nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'm here now," she said firmly. "Please do whatever you can. I'll make sure she gets the medicine she needs." The nurse nodded, reassured by Letitia's determination. "We'll start the treatment right away," she said, moving swiftly to begin the necessary procedures. Letitia watched, her heart heavy but hopeful. She knew there was a long road ahead, but she was determined to help Victoria and her mother in any way she could. Upon arriving at the clinic, she went first to the reception desk. "Hello," she said. "About 2 hours ago, Brenda should have been brought here." "And who are you to her?" asked the young woman sitting at the registration desk, uninterested. "Her mother," Letitia lied without blinking. If there was one thing she had learned in her over 50 years of life, it was that no one in a hospital would talk to someone completely unrelated to the patient. But they also wouldn't bother to check the declared degree of relationship. The girl at the desk began typing something on her computer keyboard. Then she looked at Letitia. "She's in critical condition. Visitors are currently not allowed. Can I speak to the attending physician?" "Sure. Second floor, room 23. You're in luck. It's visiting hours now." Entering the designated office, Letitia had a brief, strictly professional conversation with the doctor. Indicating that she had sufficient funds, Letitia requested that Brenda be transferred to a separate room. Furthermore, she expressed her willingness to spare no expense on medications and treatment methods. "I'll cover everything that's not covered by free healthcare," she said, regardless of the cost. Just do whatever is necessary and send me the bill. That was all she could do for the sick woman at the moment, so considering her mission accomplished, she returned home. She trusted her husband, of course, but she still wanted to make sure personally how the girl was doing. After all, she needed care and support that only a woman could offer, ideally a mother, of course, but she didn't have the luxury of choice in this situation. She found Victoria in a rather depressed state. The luxurious surroundings of the house she ended up in didn't impress her. Even the fact that she was given a separate room, something many children from less affluent families dream of, didn't lift her spirits. She sat on the bed, swinging one leg and fidgeting nervously. As soon as Letitia entered the room, the girl immediately moved toward her. "And my mom?" she asked with difficulty. "The doctors are taking care of her now. Your mom is going through a tough time, as you've seen, but her life is not in danger." This was partly a lie. With pneumonia so advanced, you couldn't be sure that the body would be able to fight the illness, even with proper treatment. But she couldn't tell a 7-year-old girl that her beloved mother was on the brink of life and death, ready to cross it at any moment. 3 days of intense anticipation passed. Although Victoria believed Letitia's words, she still couldn't find peace in her anxiety. Finally, the hospital informed them that the crisis had passed and there was no longer a threat to the patient's life. Of course, there would still be a long course of treatment ahead, but now it could be confidently stated that it would be successful. Thanks to Letitia's efforts, Victoria's mother recovered quite quickly. In a few days, her condition improved so much that Letitia was allowed to visit her. Victory also wanted to go, but her wife convinced her that it would be better if she waited for her mother's full recovery. In reality, she wasn't sure if the conversation would be suitable for a child to hear. "Hello, my name is Letitia, and as strange as it may seem, I want to inform you right away that to the hospital staff, I am your mother. I had to resort to this trick, otherwise no one would speak to me." "So you paid for my treatment," Brenda responded. "I am very grateful to you, but honestly, I don't quite understand." "You shouldn't thank me," Letitia smiled, "but rather your wonderful daughter. She's really worried about you. Don't worry, she's staying with me now and is fine." Then the woman briefly told the story of how she met Victoria thanks to a lost bank card. "I don't even know how to thank you for everything," said Brenda. "I have nothing to offer in return, and the money you spent on me, it seems I won't be able to repay in a lifetime." "I have more than enough money," Letitia replied. "You and Victoria somehow captivated me, which is why I wanted to help you, not just out of pity, though that certainly plays a part. See, tell me how you ended up in this unfortunate situation, and let's try to figure out how to avoid it happening again. The best gratitude for me would be if you and your daughter were in a warm, well-fed, and safe environment." "How I ended up here is a typical story," Brenda sighed. "Instead of studying law and getting a profession, I fell in love with Victoria's father. It was right after school. I didn't go to university. I thought, well, it's not a big deal. I'll get a job next year. Then I got pregnant and the guy immediately left me. He said he wasn't ready for such responsibility and all that. I didn't have time to study. I had to work to support Victoria and myself. And my parents didn't help either. They just drank nonstop and then they both died. And at the market where I work, the conditions are bad, so I got sick. That's the thing." Letitia, listening carefully to her story, said, "Leave your trade at the market before it completely ruins you. Recently, my housekeeper quit, and I'm looking for a replacement for her. Come live with me along with your daughter. There are many vacant rooms in the house. The salary will be decent, and we'll enroll Victoria in a good school. You won't need anything else, and if something happens, I'll also cover your medical leave." Brenda couldn't believe her luck. At a time when it seemed that all hope was lost, this woman appeared and offered to solve all the remaining problems at once. Of course, she couldn't refuse such a tempting offer. Brenda expressed her gratitude to Letitia at length, while Letitia just laughed, and they said their goodbyes. A few days later, Victoria finally convinced Letitia to take her to visit her mother. Both were incredibly happy to see each other, and it seemed that now they were finally completely at ease and stopped worrying about one another. After giving some time for mother and daughter to talk privately, Letitia took the girl back home. Truth be told, they didn't receive a warm welcome there. Right at the entrance was Rebecca, Letitia's daughter, who had unexpectedly appeared at home for the first time during that period. Neither her mother nor her father knew where she had been. When asked, she would reply that she was an adult now and didn't owe anyone an explanation, which was true. She had turned 25 that year. However, her parents were very worried that she might be getting involved with the wrong crowd, as there were some signs of that behavior. But they couldn't do anything about it and usually only saw Rebecca when she ran out of money and came home to demand more. And now she was at the door, expressing her displeasure with her entire demeanor. It seemed that her dissatisfaction was directed specifically at her mother. And when the girl spoke, it became clear that was indeed the case. "What kind of charity work are you doing here?" Rebecca began indignantly, not even bothering to greet her. "You're spending our family's money on some vagabonds, bringing anyone into the house. What are you thinking? What if this girl robs us?" "Hello, Rebecca. I'm very happy to see you," Letitia replied. "I kindly asked you not to make a scene in front of the guests. Take the girl to her room and we'll discuss everything afterward. Is that all right?" "No? So, the girl already has her own room here? What a surprise. What's next? Are you going to bring her mother here too? This is supposed to be our family home, not a shelter for the homeless." "Rebecca, I asked you," Letitia said in a calmer tone. "I'm the owner of this property, and I have the right to do what I deem necessary." With these words, she led Vittoria past the furious girl, escorted her upstairs, and asked her not to leave the room for the next hour. The girl could hear the argument downstairs and understood that she was the cause of it, but within a few minutes everything calmed down. Then footsteps could be heard on the stairs, followed by a knock. "Come in," Vittoria said, not used to such courtesy. It was Rebecca. "I would like to apologize for what I said downstairs," she said reluctantly. "It was very rude of me. I don't mind if you and your mom stay with us for a while." Her tone, even little Vittoria understood, suggested the opposite. After recovering, Brenda moved in to live with Vittoria. Vittoria was thrilled to learn that they would now stay permanently in that house. She had already gotten used to the surrounding luxury and the company of the owners. Moreover, as promised, Letitia enrolled her in a new school, an elite gymnasium. Fortunately, the girl's skills were more than enough to pass the preliminary test. Letitia's husband, Daniel, turned out to be a very pleasant, well-mannered, and highly intelligent person. It was easy for Brenda to find common ground with him, as well as with his wife. Occasionally, the three of them would engage in casual conversations over a cup of coffee in the evening. Brenda diligently fulfilled her duties, to the point where the lady of the house had to remind her from time to time that overworking is harmful to one's health. "Brenda, put down the cloth. There's no more dust on this shelf," she would say. "And in general, remember that you have a regulated workday that ended 2 hours ago. I hired you as a maid, not a slave. Let's have some coffee instead." Vittoria is eager to tell her mother what she learned at school today. Overall, things were going well for them, except for one irritating detail: Rebecca. The girl looked like an adult but behaved as if she were still 16 years old. She wasn't studying anywhere, nor was she working. She only spent her parents' money in luxury restaurants and boutiques. Her father and mother, of course, were disappointed, but they couldn't deny anything to their beloved daughter. Although Letitia often lamented that she didn't understand where they had failed in raising her or why she behaved that way. "I don't understand what kind of daughter this is. Everyone in our family is hardworking. My husband and I weren't always millionaires. We started as ordinary engineers and earned all our money through hard work." Brenda didn't please Rebecca's taste. Perhaps jealousy and misunderstanding played a role in this. Why was her mother spending her time and money on some market vendor? She tried to jab at the girl from time to time, insinuating about her previous job, her inability to dress elegantly, or her poverty. But her favorite topic, of course, was Vittoria, or rather the fact that Brenda was raising her alone without a father. The issue was that Rebecca herself had been engaged for several years, and she seemed very proud of this fact. "Strange girls who pick someone and then wonder why they were abandoned," she would say, as if speaking to a friend on the phone, but intentionally loud enough for Brenda to hear. "My Estevan isn't like that. I would never choose a guy who would get you pregnant and then leave you." Estevan caused as many problems as his fiancé. Ignoring Rebecca's provocations wasn't a difficult task for Brenda. She had already heard a lot of negativity directed at her at work. She simply continued to work calmly and ignored everything. However, Estevan would cast ambiguous glances in her direction, and when Rebecca wasn't around, he would make some rather unpleasant compliments. In short, he behaved like a typical womanizer. Undoubtedly, as the daughter of the homeowners, She could have noticed these signs if she weren't so busy with self-admiration. She had no doubt that she was absolutely irresistible and that her fiancé was madly in love with her. Brenda, on the other hand, perfectly understood that if Esteban was in love, it was only with her parents' money. It was because of this money that he was deceiving the naive Rebecca. He would be happy to find another attractive girl to latch onto. It was unknown how much longer this story would have continued and how it would have ended if a significant amount of money hadn't disappeared from the homeowner's safe one day. Anyone could have considered that Letitia and Daniel were absolute extroverts, and their house always had many guests. Rebecca, of course, had her own version of the money's disappearance. "You ungrateful snake," she said as soon as Letitia gathered everyone for a family meeting and informed them of the situation. "My parents practically brought you back from the dead, and this is how you repay them? As if they don't pay you enough for your insignificant work? Or maybe it was your daughter who took it. She's already shown herself to be a thief." "Rebecca, stop," her mother interrupted abruptly. "I don't believe Brenda could have stolen that money." "Then who else?" the girl persisted. "Do you think it was me?" "I didn't say that. Who knows what could have happened? I think we should call the police and let them investigate everything. But before that, if any of you needed that money, no matter the reason, I suggest you confess now, and we won't involve the police. Return everything that was stolen by tomorrow, and we'll pretend this never happened." "Yes," Rebecca intervened, immediately resuming her accusations. "And get out of our house and back to your market, although prison would be better for you." "Enough, Rebecca," her mother interrupted again. "I won't listen to unfounded accusations. I said what I had to say. I'm giving you all time to think." Brenda, even knowing she was innocent, had a sleepless night. She was worried, understanding that no one would investigate anything. The poor woman, who had been taken in as a maid out of pity, stole money from the homeowners. This was the simplest explanation, and no proof was necessary. On the other hand, she felt a subtle change in how she was treated. The homeowners, although remaining impeccably polite, displayed a certain coldness towards her. Letitia had said she didn't believe Brenda could be a thief, but it was clear that even she had her doubts. And if the money magically reappeared in the safe tomorrow, without a doubt, everyone would think she was responsible. No matter how she looked at the situation, it seemed hopeless. Perhaps Rebecca had taken the money from her parents without asking to incriminate Brenda. After all, Brenda had no reason to steal. Her parents would have given her practically any amount of money without asking unnecessary questions. It was late when Vittoria entered her room. The girl lived in the room next door and must have heard her mother tossing and turning in bed, unable to sleep. Maybe she'd come to ask about what had happened. Brenda had already begun to think about what she would say to her. One thing was for herself, but for her daughter. How would she explain to Vittoria why they were unexpectedly leaving paradise, something that seemed almost inevitable to her? She didn't yet know that her lovely daughter had not come with questions or comfort, but with a solution to her own problem. "Mom, please forgive me," the girl began with words she never expected to hear. "Why?" she asked cautiously, fearing the worst deep down. "I know it's not good to eavesdrop on other people's conversations, and that adults sometimes talk about things children shouldn't hear, but it happened. I know what you were talking about in the kitchen today, and I also know who took the money you were talking about. And when I saw him doing it, I wondered if Mr. and Miss had allowed it, but I recorded it on my phone." Brenda hugged her daughter tightly. How smart she was growing and diplomatic, too. Not long ago, Vittoria had received a smartphone as a birthday present from Letitia. There were no objections from the girl's mother. She didn't even consider it. She said that even for studying, kids needed phones these days. And you have enough other things to spend your money on, so let it be. And now this smartphone came in handy at the most unexpected moment. The next day, of course, there was no money in the safe. Rebecca was unusually quiet this time, but a malicious smile played on her lips. It seemed she was absolutely sure that the hated maid would disappear from her life forever. However, an extremely unpleasant surprise awaited Brenda. Although kind and gentle by nature, she had to make an effort to suppress her own shadow. After all, this girl had cost her many unpleasant experiences. But now she had the chance to bring her down, and perhaps she would finally understand how wrong she had been acting all this time. "Well then," Letitia said sadly, opening the safe and confirming that the missing money had not magically reappeared. It seems we'll have to call the police unless, of course, someone wants to tell me something right now. Wait, Brenda began. She saw the triumph in Rebecca's eyes and how her mother's face grew sad. I know who took the money, and I have proof. Victoria saw the thief and recorded it on her phone. Placing her smartphone in a way that everyone could see the screen, she began the recording. Although the sound was poor, it was still possible to clearly see who was taking the money from the safe and carefully closing it. It turned out to be Estevan, Rebecca's fiancé. Despite everything, the homeowners decided not to involve the police. After all, Estevan wasn't a complete stranger. They simply demanded that he return the money, threatening to involve the authorities if he didn't comply. Estevan was incredibly angry with both Rebecca's parents and Rebecca herself. He caused a shameful scene right in their home, yelling about how they already had so much money and how they couldn't spare a small amount that he desperately needed. In the end, he added that he didn't want anything more to do with such stingy people, including their daughter, of course, and stormed out, slamming the door. Contrary to Brenda's hopes, this situation didn't calm Rebecca down. In fact, it made her even more unbearable. As soon as the door closed behind her now obviously ex-fiancé, she began shouting with twice the intensity. So, some random girl can steal money from your card, she screamed at her mother, but your own daughter's fiancé can't even borrow a small sum. Come on, it's just pocket change. You wouldn't even notice. Do you even know what your so-called fiancé needed the money for? Her mother responded quietly. What does that matter? It matters. We've never denied you or him small expenses, but this time it was a significant amount. And if it were for a good cause, we would have given it. And he knew that, which means there's something about it we wouldn't approve of, Daniel reasoned. You never approve of anything when it comes to me. Rebecca continued to throw a tantrum. You've ruined someone's life, mine too. She stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door. In the hallway, she bumped into Brenda, who was cleaning the coat racks, trying to ignore the escalating argument in the kitchen. It wasn't easy since Rebecca was yelling so loudly that the whole house could hear. Brenda could only be relieved that her daughter was at school and didn't hear all this horror. You! Rebecca shifted her focus to Brenda as soon as she noticed her. It's all because of you. Ever since you came into this house, I knew it wouldn't end well. What a clever girl you are, recording a video on your phone to catch the thief. And I believed Estevan and me, we loved each other, and you just couldn't stand it. You couldn't keep your own man and decided to sow discord between us. Rebecca, Brenda tried to reason with her. Can't you see? Estevan only loved your money. As soon as he realized he could no longer get his hands in your parents' pockets, he left immediately. Don't you dare speak ill of him like that. Don't even dare to say his name. How do you even have the audacity to talk to me? The following days at home turned into a living hell for Brenda, from which she tried diligently to protect her daughter. However, Victoria still heard the constant arguments that now flared up at the slightest provocation. The poor girl began to feel guilty for what she had done and for showing the recording, but she just wanted to save her mother. Rebecca didn't let up, repeatedly threatening that she would never set foot in the house again. Instead, she created scenes that were embarrassing for both her parents and Brenda. The only thing she had enough tact to do was avoid having explicit confrontations in the child's presence. All we need to do is get through this, Letitia said one night after another scandal. Both she and all of us. She's devastated. It seems she really was in love with that scoundrel, and now she's going through his betrayal. This will pass, she said confidently, but her voice was trembling. Brenda could see that even the head of the family would soon lose her composure. She felt a deep pity for this beautiful woman, but couldn't even imagine how she could help her. Moreover, she also felt guilty for everything that had been happening lately. But one day, everything changed. It would have been nice if it had happened because Rebecca finally realized everything and calmed down. However, the reason was completely different and unfortunately was not joyful at all. The tragedy that occurred truly silenced the entire house. But now every resident wanted to return to the times when the dishes in the kitchen clattered with the shouts of the daughter of the house owners. Brenda was sitting on her bed reading when Rebecca burst into the room. For a moment, it seemed like she was about to start another argument, but the next second it became clear that something had happened. The girl's face was pale as chalk, and tears were rolling down her cheeks. With difficulty, she managed to say, Dad had an accident. He's in the hospital. He needs a blood transfusion. Mom is asking if you would agree to come with us and donate blood. He has a rare blood type, so the more options, the better. Of course, the woman simply replied without going into detail, as she herself didn't know. She explained that Daniel was seriously ill and needed help, so all the adults had to leave for a while. "You will be responsible for the house. Behave yourself," she said. "Of course, Mom." They quickly gathered their things and headed to the hospital. Letitia wanted to drive herself, but they managed to convince her, through joint efforts, to wait for a driver. Her hands were shaking. An hour later, they were at the blood transfusion station. One by one, samples were taken from all of them for compatibility tests and other necessary analyses. Holding their breath, the three women waited for the results in the corridor, jumping every time a door opened. They all understood perfectly well that time was running out. Rebecca was holding her father's hand firmly, behaving extremely restlessly, rocking her legs, sniffling, and sometimes crying softly. "What if Dad dies and the last thing I said to him was, 'He's not going to die,'" Letitia interrupted her, but her voice lacked the conviction she was trying to portray. Brenda did her best to calm the girl down, even though she herself was trembling. Despite the strained relationship between her and Rebecca, she felt sorry for the girl. Perhaps she was too spoiled by loving parents and had never before encountered real difficulties in life. Now both of them were going through a shared suffering that brought them together. After all, for Brenda, Daniel had become almost like a father figure, something she had never really had. Her biological father had never shown interest in her life. In fact, all her parents cared about was the presence of alcohol in the house. In a way, Letitia and Daniel had replaced her mother and father, giving her the warmth that was so lacking in her childhood. Finally, the door of the designated office opened and a doctor emerged. His expression was extremely perplexed. It was impossible to tell what news he carried as he walked toward them. However, all three hoped for the best, but were clearly unprepared for what they were about to hear in the next few minutes. "Frankly, now is not the most appropriate time to discuss this, but Rebecca, you are not related to our patient," and then turning to Letitia, "Nor are you." The last sentence was directed at Letitia, and unfortunately your blood is not suitable for transfusion. All three tried to make sense of what was said, but it simply didn't fit in their minds. It seemed absurd. What did it mean that Rebecca was not related to Letitia or Daniel? How was that possible? It was shocking, but somehow it was overshadowed by the last statement about the blood not being suitable. Meanwhile, the doctor allowed them a moment to process the information and continued. "However, your blood," pointing to Brenda, "is a perfect match, and even without detailed analysis, I can say that you are a fairly close relative of our patient." There was no time for speculation, and Brenda agreed to donate blood for Daniel. Just an hour later, the complex operation to save his life began. There was a collective sigh of relief. Of course, there was always a risk that something could go wrong, especially considering the severity of the patient's condition. However, the best doctors that could be found in such a short time were fighting for Daniel's life. Moreover, one of the most challenging aspects was finding suitable blood for him. The operation lasted several hours but ended up being successful. Daniel remained in a stable but critical condition, with the major threats to his life eliminated. Now all they could do was trust what the donation center had told them. Brenda turned out to be a blood relative, most likely his daughter. However, Rebecca had no connection to either of them. To unravel this mystery, Letitia sought the help of private detectives. They conducted an investigation that ended up being quite straightforward. The town was small, with a low population growth rate. Not many births occurred, and they were relatively infrequent. As a result, only 2 women gave birth in one of the 3 maternity hospitals on the specified date. Letitia was one of them. At that time, when Letitia's family was not yet wealthy, they couldn't afford a private room, so she stayed in a shared one. They were pleased to have only one person sharing the room with her, almost like a VIP service without the extra cost. Letitia remembered that time well and her roommate at the hospital. The woman was not particularly talkative. On the contrary, she constantly muttered and complained about life. Starting a conversation with her would have been difficult. However, she didn't cause any problems, so no one paid much attention to her. In contrast to Letitia, who received regular visits from her husband, parents, and friends, no one came to see the other expectant mother. It was clear that she came from an unhappy family and seemed destined to continue her marginalized lifestyle even after giving birth. It was sad for this person who, even before coming into the world, was already unwanted by everyone. However, there was nothing that could be done about it. Both women gave birth one day apart and both had girls. Both were healthy and strong, bringing joy to their mothers. All four had to spend a few more days in the hospital after delivery. Letitia, who had a difficult childbirth, barely remembered the subsequent events, which explained why she didn't notice the switch. It was carried out by one of the midwives. The hospital administration discovered it quite quickly, but it was already after both mothers had been discharged. In typical fashion for government institutions, especially in small provincial towns, it was decided not to make a fuss about the matter, as it was impossible to discreetly correct the situation at that point. They left everything as it was and simply fired the midwife, who soon found herself under lifelong psychiatric care. The baby switch was probably the reason for her placement there, but no one bothered to investigate further why she had behaved that way. However, the detectives managed to uncover the motives behind her actions. Beyond her mental disorder, it turned out to be pure envy. She had decided that if she was going through misery, then no one in this world should be happy, especially the well-off woman who was also capable of conceiving and giving birth to a child. And that woman happened to be Letitia. As it happened, the midwife also desperately wanted to have children, but all her attempts ended in failure. At first, she struggled to conceive for a long time, and when it finally happened, she discovered that she was physically incapable of carrying a child. As a result, she had a miscarriage at an early stage. Since then, she harbored resentment toward all the women who, unlike her, could have children. However, she didn't leave her job because she had nowhere else to go. Slowly, year after year, she began to lose her sanity as she witnessed happy mothers whom she had helped deliver their babies. Of course, no one noticed. Then, at the moment Letitia was giving birth, something in this unhappy woman's mind finally snapped. Perhaps it was because this mother had everything the midwife didn't have: a loving husband, caring friends and parents, a well-paid job, and wonderful prospects. And now, on top of it all, a child. The midwife decided that she needed to ruin this perfect life a little and swap the baby with a child from a marginalized woman who happened to give birth almost simultaneously. It's understandable that, like it or not, genetics will reveal itself. It wouldn't be easy for that woman to raise someone else's child, especially a child like that. Ironically, Letitia and Daniel's biological daughter ended up in the hands of alcoholic parents who never gave her the attention she deserved. Meanwhile, Rebecca was fortunate and ended up in a family that was destined to become very wealthy in the near future, and they were already well off at that time. But as the midwife had anticipated, the girl's character was influenced not only by her upbringing, but also by genetic traits. That's why she behaved the way she did. Moreover, she believed that all her parents' money and everything they had achieved belonged to her by birthright. "And now?" Rebecca asked after hearing the story. "And now?" Letitia exclaimed in surprise. "Well, that means I'm not your biological daughter, and I don't have the right to be here at all." "Don't talk nonsense," her mother replied. "I fed you, raised you, nurtured you, and loved you all these years. Of course, how could I not love you? Who knows who might have swapped the babies and who your biological parents are? You are my daughter. Of course, you're willing to consider me your mother now, right?" "Of course, Mom, I love you too," Rebecca said, tears welling up in her eyes, and she ran to hug Letitia. Brenda watched the scene with a feeling of awkwardness, not knowing what to do now. It turned out that her real parents were this wealthy couple who had done so much for her and her daughter, but they didn't raise her. They didn't hear her first word, didn't witness her first steps, and it wasn't to them that she brought home her first good grade or her first impressive drawing. Although the people who raised her didn't pay attention to those things either, she still loved them, the ones she considered her parents. There were good moments, after all. They still raised her and didn't let her starve. They clothed and fed her, never hit her or anything like that. Yes, her childhood couldn't be called particularly happy, but it wasn't entirely terrible either. Her parents, although they drank most of the time, were never violent. Even when they ran out of alcohol, they usually just slept, only to go out and get another bottle the next morning. Occasionally, one of them would find some odd job, so the family didn't need to go hungry. It wasn't exactly a life of well-being, but it wasn't always the worst either. Brenda found early memories of her childhood resurfacing in her mind, from a time when her mother was still sober. Her father was already drinking at that time, But he hadn't yet completely dragged his wife down with him, and she diligently cared for the baby she clearly loved in her own way. Brenda remembered how her mother rejoiced at her first steps and how she read bedtime stories when she herself was a little younger than Vittoria is now. She could go to her mother with any sadness and receive support, and how her mother took pride in and was pleased with even the smallest and most insignificant achievements of her daughter. Gradually, she stopped caring. Whether Brenda was dressed, had shoes, or had eaten every day, none of it mattered. Everything was fine, whatever. The stories of her daughter no longer touched her maternal heart. All that interested this woman now was the presence or absence of the coveted bottle. Perhaps things would have been different if she had found the strength to leave her husband, but for some reason she continued to cling to him, whether out of habit or fear that she wouldn't survive on her own. Though it seemed that the father had no involvement in the family's life, she might not have been aware of that. Brenda tried to study diligently and rebelled several times. She even ran away from home for a long time, but no one looked for her, no one cared. This story ended in a rather predictable way. Her parents drank themselves to death, and one day when she came home, she found them lifeless. It happened to be her 18th birthday that day. She felt something strange. Yes, despite everything, she deeply mourned her mother and father and was grateful to them for somehow raising her to adulthood. She knew that deep down, they loved her, at least that applied to her mother. As for Letitia, she was essentially a stranger, someone whose fate she got involved with out of pity and kindness. Brenda was grateful to this woman, felt a warm attachment to her, but wasn't certain that these feelings were mutual. "I have enough space in my heart for both daughters," the woman said, as if reading her thoughts. "In fact, I always thought it would be nice if Rebecca had a little sister or brother, but the first childbirth was very difficult, so I never wanted to go through that again." She hugged Brenda tightly, and a few seconds later, Brenda felt Rebecca joining the embrace. It seemed like a truly miraculous reunion of a long-lost family. Only one person was missing to complete this picture. Daniel was discharged from the hospital only several months later, even though improvements had occurred much earlier. Until that moment, everyone visited him as a family, including little Vittoria. As expected, the man was very surprised by the story of the baby switch, but like Letitia, he was happy to now have two daughters. Rebecca apologized for her abominable behavior to her parents and to Brenda, whom she now referred to as nothing less than a sister. Of course, it wasn't just the fact that she discovered she wasn't the biological daughter that influenced this change. The accident that nearly took her father's life also had a strong impact, forcing her to reconsider certain things, and the support Brenda gave her during that difficult time convinced the girl that she had been unjust to her. The shared sadness brought them together, helping them understand each other and develop a certain mutual sympathy. And then they discovered they were connected more closely than they could have ever imagined. As for little Vittoria, she seemed completely surprised when they gently told her, omitting unnecessary details about the situation. Such stories were still part of the young girl's understanding of the world. So, the girl simply rejoiced in having a grandmother and grandfather. Over time, she also got used to her aunt, although it wasn't easy considering Rebecca's past behavior. But she did her best to make amends with her parents and their daughter. When Daniel fully recovered, his extended family reunited and lived quite harmoniously in the same large mansion. Sometime after his return, the father gathered all the adults for a family meeting. He chose a time when Vittoria was at school, ensuring that she wouldn't hear anything unnecessary. The reason for the meeting was serious, and it was unlikely that the child needed to know anything about it. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, "since I regained consciousness and managed to piece together the facts. Then you all told me about how Brenda and Rebecca were switched at birth, which understandably pushed everything else out of my mind for a while. But then the thoughts returned, and I must inform you that the accident I was involved in was not a mere coincidence." A tense silence hung in the air as everyone tried to grasp the meaning of Daniel's words, and it seemed that everyone arrived at a similar conclusion. In his characteristically gentle manner, the father had just informed them that someone had tried to kill him. The revelation shocked and frightened everyone. No one dared to say anything. All were waiting for the continuation of his speech, and soon it came. "I believe someone tampered with my brakes. But beyond that, it's possible that someone forced me off the road into that very ravine where my car fell. I can't be sure because I remember very little of the moment of the fall. I only remember that the brakes didn't work when they should have. I had recently passed a routine inspection, and everything was in order. But if that's the case, it means that someone who knew when and where I would be traveling did this. But who could wish you harm? Rebecca exclaimed in horror. Well, for example, you, Daniel joked, using his tone to indicate it was just a joke. But seriously, I don't know, and that's what bothers me the most. Someone may have targeted not just me personally, but our entire family. And in that case, all of you are in danger. That's why I gathered you all here. I want you to be extra cautious until the culprit is found. And today I'm going to file a report with the police and let them investigate. And so they did. The report was filed and the police began their work, knowing they were dealing with an influential person in the city. They made sure to conduct the investigation with the utmost care. They began by inspecting the car, which confirmed Daniel's concerns. The brakes had indeed been tampered with. Additionally, some dents on the car's body could not have been caused by the fall into the ravine, so his vague recollection of the car being pushed was validated. Someone wanted to ensure that their plan worked perfectly and that Daniel wouldn't survive the car accident. As soon as the family was informed of this discovery, armed security was hired for each of them. This included Vittoria, for whom they explained that these escorts would temporarily accompany her to and from school. Brenda insisted that her daughter be protected by women to make her more comfortable. Going anywhere else was forbidden for the time being. The young girl, understanding that such restrictions wouldn't be imposed without reason, didn't argue. All vehicles were thoroughly checked by the guards before each trip. Fortunately, nothing else suspicious was found, but no one considered letting their guard down. It was possible that this was just a precaution and that after the failed attempt, the perpetrator had backed off from their plans. Or perhaps they had a personal vendetta against Daniel and not the entire family. But it never hurts to be cautious. Meanwhile, the investigation continued at full speed. All family members were thoroughly interrogated, but no one could remember anything suspicious that day. Everything was as usual. No one could imagine who Daniel might have angered to the point that someone would want to kill them. The joint business with his wife was conducted honestly without crossing anyone's path. They earned a considerable amount by the city's standards, but not enough for someone to want to take over their business or anything like that. In any case, the initial investigation suggesting that the attempted murder was somehow connected to the business was considered inconclusive. They then began to develop the idea that it could be a personal vendetta, and that's when the first and only suspect emerged. A serious conflict that had recently occurred in this family involved Rebecca's ex-fiancé. Only he had some motives for seeking revenge. Of course, it was quite hard to believe that he would attempt to kill Daniel simply because he was prevented from stealing money. Sure, even Rebecca had realized by then that Estevan was, to say the least, an untrustworthy person. But there's a difference between a scammer, or even a thief, and a murderer. Moreover, there were no threats from him to the family. He simply left, slamming the door, and no one heard anything about him afterward. For a while, Rebecca tried to contact her ex-fiancé, but he simply didn't answer her calls. In essence, none of them knew anything about Estevan. Did he work somewhere or study? Who did he associate with? What did he do in his free time? Who were his parents? The police had to find all this out, and after some time, they discovered that he indeed had a motive to wish for Daniel's death. "We found out," said the investigator when summoned, "that this person indeed carried out the assassination attempt against you. However, you can dismiss the security detail. He won't bother you anymore." "Why are you so sure of that?" Daniel asked. "Because he's dead. We didn't have to search for long. His body was found in his own home." As it turned out, Estevan was involved in some major financial manipulations and also liked to gamble. He was lucky for a while, but at some point luck left him, and he found himself owing a substantial amount of money to serious criminal authorities. They had no intention of waiting for him to marry Rebecca and acquire the money in a more or less official way. That's why he decided to steal, hoping that no one would investigate the matter and everything would be blamed on the recently appeared maid. But the plan didn't work, and he had no other way to get a large sum of money. Estevan realized that it was all over. Those people he got involved with would certainly come after him and take the money or his life. So he decided that if he was going to die, he wouldn't do it alone, and tried to take with him the one he considered responsible for his downfall, the investigator commented, concluding his narrative. "Thanks to your attention and dedication, we managed to expose the gang we had been pursuing for several years. Soon, they will all find themselves behind bars where they belong." After weeks of tension, the family finally breathed a sigh of relief. The armed security was dismissed. Vittoria was allowed to go out and meet her school friends again. Numerous guests began visiting the house once more, and everyone was happy to see them. Thanks to Vittoria's strong desire, after several months of debates, persuasion, and negotiations, the family decided to adopt a dog. True to her promise, the girl took care of the puppy herself, walking, feeding, and caring for it. At this stage of her life, she was doing well in school and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. Brenda and Rebecca eventually became great friends and spent much of their free time together. Rebecca pulled herself together and enrolled in college, realizing that it's never too late to pursue a good profession. Letitia and Daniel hoped that their daughters would help them with the business and eventually take over the management of the company. Thus, the story that began with a simple card on the street came to a truly happy ending, thanks to the courage and dedication of everyone involved.